Welcome to the last session of Wednesday, everyone, and join me in welcoming Nathan.
Hi, so yeah, like it says, my name is Nathan Willis, and we're going to talk about that situation where you have no documentation for your project. Sort of the subtitle here, my goal is to convince you that this tragically common situation is not as painful to solve as you think. We know this happens a lot, right? Like most projects who have missing documentation are aware that they need to fix that. It's really just sort of a practical issue that it feels more and more daunting the longer you let it slip, and it's easy to let it slip again and again. Doing nothing is the default. Panicking is also kind of an easy choice to make. But in reality, what you need to do is take that first step. So my intended takeaway is that you can break down this intimidatingly large seeming task into things that you feel comfortable tackling, including plenty that aren't actually writing. And the most important of those are more like planning tasks. So you should feel empowered to do that. A little bit about me. I'm currently working on a PhD in England on some of the little technical bits of how we make fonts. About 3 times I've been part of from scratch, greenfield, write all the missing documentation undertaking. We survived all 3 of those. The one I'm going to talk most about, and that is the most recent, is HarfBuzz. But by training, I'm not a doc writer. For many, many years, I was a full-time tech journalist, just covering open source and free software. But that's a very different kind of writing than documentation writing. So what I have to offer is more like Frontline's perspective than the conceptual stuff that documentation writing experts can share with you. I'm going to try and get through this without you having to care too much about what HarfBuzz is. It's a low-level font shaping library, which in simplest terms takes little sequences of Unicode characters and turns them into correctly positioned and substituted glyphs from a font. So on the left there you see Bengali, and if you just naively took the Unicode values from the font file and put them on screen, you would get the image on the left, which has this dotted circle that isn't real, when in reality they're supposed to combine together into this other character. And then on the right here is an Arabic example. As you probably know, Arabic is like cursive, it's a connected script. And so making sure those things actually connect is not something you want to have to do manually yourself. HarfBuzz does that for you. It's not super important that you understand that stuff, except for the fact that it's a low-level library, which means it's usually used by application frameworks rather than applications directly. And it usually gets adopted by a mature project with an existing code base already doing some text handling. And those can be significant when you're writing documentation. And it has this odd property where 95% of the usage is one function. It's called HBShape. It just attempts to do the right thing for all scripts covered in Unicode. There's a bunch of support functions for getting into the weeds when it's not quite what's expected. But that's kind of unusual. The other 5% is some command line utilities, and then there's like rounding error stuff. But that will matter later on in the story. I'm also going to try and not bore you with the standard spiels about documentation that you've heard before. I mean, yes, I hope I don't have to convince you need documentation or that you need someone who understands what they're writing. It's also important to realize that you ought to build formal review in when you're writing documentation, and you need to like define style guides and things like that, and make sure you have usable code examples. That's just generally good advice. What I am going to focus on are some high-level concepts, like structuring your documentation for progressive rollout. Progressive rollout's a really good thing. If you plan for this, then you don't have to wait until you've finished 100% of it to drop it on people, and there's benefits to doing it that way. And then I have my attempt at a clever little slogan about documentation being like an API, which is really just sort of a concept for how you plan things to ensure that you write useful docs. And I'll share some practical tips and on a little bit about automation, because I know it's a big topic these days. A decent chunk of this is probably viable advice for any documentation effort, but I'm intending to look at the we have nothing use case, which in the HarfBuzz project, which I spent about a year on in between the master's degree and starting the PhD, I think there's some distinct challenges that come from that situation. So let's start with the planning phase stuff. Step 0, you do want to stage a large documentation project as discrete units, standalone, self-contained chunks that you can put out there one chunk at a time. I think we do as much harm as good when, like, as the foss community, we refer to the documentation as if it's a monolithic, indivisible thing. It's pretty clear, I think, that structuring for progressive rollout helps you deploy and helps you test the documentation in a meaningful manner, but I think it also forces you to write clearer and to create more useful docs. And when you have this situation where you've got a project with no documentation at all, if you don't plan it in manageable chunks like that, your chances of success are really low. So the most important thing you do at this planning phase is identifying the target readers, your eventual target readers, because they're hypothetical people when you have no documentation. And this needs to be discussed as a project. You don't just want to internally mull it over for a few seconds. And that's also sort of standard spiel stuff, but I want to dig into it a little bit more. What you usually see is this split, user and developer. And that's not granular enough to be of any real practical value in my experience. At the very least, potential users and current users have different needs. And there's multiple kinds of developers. I think you typically think of that as being synonymous with project member, when this other category that I'm calling integrator adopter is something we don't talk about a lot. But that's like anybody who's downstream of you, whether they're internally using code from your project, or they're just trying to understand the algorithm you're using, or they're just trying to port it to some odd piece of hardware they have. You might get bug reports from people like that, but you're probably not, they're not there for the long term. They're probably not going to be contributors, and so they don't need to be told, like, welcome to the project. We hope you stick around necessarily. So when we did this for the HarfBuzz docs, it was the potential user and the integrator were the two categories that really needed documentation. And that's because the current users, people already using HarfBuzz, tended to have problems that were as much about the Unicode specification as they were about HarfBuzz. So the way you solve their problems is mostly through discussion and helping them triage. And again, it's worth pointing out that the HarfBuzz use case that I'm using for examples is not necessarily the same as an end user application. It's a library. So the users here are typically writing software, but in the general case, you have multiple kinds of users and multiple kinds of developers, and you need to identify with as much specificity as you can what they're like. Because identifying those people identifies the top level units of your documentation, or at least the top level or two. You still have to decide what's most in need of being documented and what you want to tackle first. So again, from the HarfBuzz case, potential users really needed a manual that explained HBShape and how that fit into their text chain. Whereas integrators and adopters really needed more of a reference book. What are the symbols, what are the return values, that sort of thing. You can't blend those sorts of documentation together. The next step after this is getting into the content. Some of the content you need to cover, you'll have a very easy time putting into a list, but you do need to connect it to what people are actually asking about, which means that your prior or lack of documentation can be used to your advantage. You can mine the issue tracker and the mailing list for what people are actually asking about. In HarfBuzz, we found that one of the biggest sets of questions was people not understanding why HarfBuzz was necessary, which basically means they're speaking a European language and aren't familiar with Arabic or Indian writing systems or anything like that. And that meant that the manual had to talk about those things. And sort of a corollary here is don't forget about stuff like IRC and personal email and conversations and the hallway track, because that's sort of transient information your developers can probably retain in memory, but if it's not written down, you risk losing that when you're planning out your contents. Let's see. I think it's also important at this stage, when you have your documentation units, to sort of write out the goal of each chunk of documentation in really concrete terms. We just say define the task that the unit will solve. In the HarfBuzz case, the user manual will show how to add script support to an existing text handling chain inside a program. It will explain how to use the command utilities to get more information, that sort of thing. At this point, also, I found it really valuable to start assembling a cheat sheet of all the external references you need. This is things like projects that you depend on that you'll have to point people to as they're reading an explanation. It's specifications you implement, algorithms, white papers that you reference, because in documentation you want to reference these things as you go along, but it's very disruptive to the writing process to have to stop and hunt for those. Besides, when you collect a long list of these, you might find that you don't have to cover as much ground yourself as you thought initially, if you have a lot of references to give people. And then the fifth item here is outlining, which is kind of in a gray area, whether you call that planning or writing. I would say outlining is critical because when you start with as full an outline as you can make, that helps you, for example, ensure that each documentation unit is standing on its own. So the more detailed you make that, the clearer you will find places where there's gaps between your sections or your chapters. But writing outlines can be hard for people. I think it takes a little effort. And a corollary here that we didn't do in the HarfBuzz project was it's a good idea to publish your outlines for the rest of the project to see. Maybe not everyone in the world will care, but publish your rollout plan. I sort of wish we had done that once I got started. It was not just a retrospect thing, but that communicates to people on the team what's happening. And it's also helpful as you're rolling out documentation in chunks for people to understand how it's going to fit together and not think that you're done when you have left many things unaddressed so far. So when you're at that, I'm ready to start writing point. A concept I found useful is to think about the documentation collection like it's an interface to your code base. Oops, let me back up one. A couple of ways to sort of express that. APIs are designed to be consumed by users, so are docs. And like I was saying in the previous section, thinking about the user means thinking about the specific task that they're trying to accomplish. And that helps you shape the format in addition to defining what you need to document. For instance, if most of your users have one problem, you can talk with, you can spend a lot of time addressing the use case. If everyone seems to have a different problem, you're going to need to have a lot of different examples, and that means, sort of restructuring that chapter. Another example, if most of your users are replacing an older component with your code, then what you're really looking at is a porting guide, and you don't necessarily, or you might have to spend as much time talking about the project they're replacing as your project. And another way to think about that is the goal of the documentation isn't to describe what the code does, it's to explain how the user will use the code to solve their problem, which I think is something generally we would all agree with, but sometimes it's useful to put it in those terms. Another API facet I think relates to documentation is that you have to have a clean distinction between internal and external. If you mix those together in documentation, you confuse the reader and it's at your own peril. And it's also going to be much harder for your writers to keep those separate. I'm sorry. If you don't keep them separate, you're giving your writers a much more difficult task, I should say. It's also interesting to realize that A lot of times APIs give you more than one way to access some core functionality, and that's a documentation issue too, right? You have to structure your docs so that someone who's arrived from a random web search and lands on chapter 6 can get their bearings and figure out where they are. And at a smaller scale, you have to repeat a lot of information because you don't know whether someone has just dropped in to look for something particular or they've been reading since chapter 1. And it's not bad to repeat things and have multiple ways to find the same information. Sometimes when you're learning writing in school, for essays and things, you really have the opposite of that reinforced and you don't repeat yourself. But in software documentation, brevity is not the goal. And then this one is, I think, is really critical and tricky to get right. And that's that APIs reflect design decisions. And so for your documentation, this is assuming that you made some design decisions. But what I mean is that your documentation should mirror the code's design. Functionally separate pieces should have functionally separate docs, not all be mushed together. That might sound obvious, but there are certainly other approaches. For example, a lot of times documentation mirrors the structure of the team. Everyone sort of writes about their own little piece. My suspicion is that this is an easy trap to fall into when you're in one of those giant multi-company collaborative projects. I don't work on those projects, so I don't know. But it's a recipe for confusion when people are writing in isolation of each other. Another very common issue is that a project's docs might just mirror the history of the project. So at some point, they moved from their own domain to github.io, and so half the documentation is one place, half of it's in another place. That's the same issue. It's not reflecting the code's design, it's reflecting something else. There's an example of this that I don't want to call out by name, but a GUI application that I use on a regular basis has a lot of functionality implemented as extensions, and at some point they switched from having a C extension API to a Python extension API. In the menus, those functions are all intermingled, but to find the documentation on how to use them, you have to know if that was written in C or Python, which you're not going to know just from using the program. So that could use some cleanup. And this could also be an awkward thing for people who have learned how to write. Like I was saying, 95% of HarfBuzz is one function, HBShape. The other 5% is command line utilities. So the top level sections in the user manual reflect that split, and they kind of look like this, lengthwise, which looks weird. Like if you have engineering in your background, you kind of think, well, that's a very unbalanced data structure. We should. And some of the previous attempts to write documentation for HarfBuzz were like, well, let's pull out the Unicode information into a separate chapter, but that's a mistake. Someone who is accessing the manual is either using HBShape or they're using the command line utilities. There's nothing else that they're doing. So even though there's some Unicode normalization functions in there, they're not used separately. They're used in HBShape. So it's awkward, but it's how you would actually read it. And then the last bit here, hopefully, you can return error messages in an API, and you can do that with your documentation as well, which is to say, don't forget about helping users figure out what to do when things go wrong. And in my personal experience, distributions and web browsers are really bad about this. Fedora and Ubuntu will tell you how your microphone should work, but if your microphone doesn't work, you'll have to go to discussion forums to find out why. On the flip side, programming languages tend to be really, really good at this, probably for obvious reasons. That's just such a different use case. So that's all planning stuff. Let's get into the full-blown writing. I'm going to toss out some axiomatic statements that may or may not annoy people who have done more documentation writing than me. Number one, my advice is don't adopt a markup language until the last possible moment. This keeps you focused on the words. We know there's tool chains. You can always use Pandoc or whatever to convert when you're ready to publish things for consumption. Eventually, you will hit a wall here, and you will have to start using markup. But delay that as long as you can. I think this concept is akin to this really famous pseudo quote by Richard Feynman. I tried to find the actual quote, and it's much wordier and sort of third hand. But he's talking about explaining physics. My paraphrase here as a corollary is, if you can't explain it without markup, then you probably don't really understand it. This is a discipline to impose on yourself when you're writing, but you get stronger writing out of it. Worrying about the markup takes up more of your time. Often as not, it limits you, so you start just thinking about how to format things. And it's also sort of a sneaky way to avoid bike shedding. The toolchain you use to build your docs is very important, but my whole thesis here is that you need the words more than you need anything else, so focus on that. Secondly, and this has come up sort of before, you do need to repeat yourself because you don't know, your documentation is random access, whether you like it or not, but you need to take caution to repeat yourself in the exact way every time. That's considered bad writing in prose to repeat the same term many times in a row, but it's pretty vital for technical documentation. For instance, if you refer to something as the user preferences menu on one line, don't then just refer to it as the preferences later on. That's hard to do for a writer. It's hard for normal people to do, but the confusion that results from that can kill someone's reading experience. And this is something that I think is very hard for like style checkers and linters to catch. This also applies to external links. We also kind of resist this. If you've come from some other sort of writing, academic writing or journalism, you link on the first instance of a term, and then you just refer to it from now on. Whereas if somebody has arrived at the paragraph that they're reading by using Control F and looked for a term, they're not going to have seen the first reference. So repeat the links as often as you need to, if you're referring especially to something that they'll need to look up, like a specification. I also say do your level best to make having an FAQ unnecessary. And it's just too tempting once an FAQ exists to turn it into a dumping ground. And it's too easy to skip something in the real docs by saying, oh, that's already covered in the frequently asked questions. Besides, an FAQ is inherently a list of miscellaneous stuff, which means it's not navigable. You have to read through the entire list to see if your question is there. And that's just a bad experience for the readers. Instead, try to make your table of contents as detailed as you can. I know it's easy to skip table of contents, but people look for the topic at the top of the page, and if they can find it, and ideally, you have answered their question, then by putting that in context of all the other contents, it's easier for people to find it, and fewer people end up asking the question. This is pretty idealistic. I guess I'm just saying, try not to plan on having an FAQ if you can avoid it. And yeah, like I've mentioned a couple different times, you need to do things to make sure that people who are reading in the middle, who start reading in the middle, are not confused. And this gets into, well, at this point I'm referring to like, okay. It's a navigation and discovery issue. Refer back to the previous section, refer to what's going to come in the next section, especially if you're doing something like that's linear, like a tutorial. Recap where the reader should be. That allows them, if they've started in the middle, to get their bearings. And it's also good if you're just reading and you're getting tired. And there's a side benefit here as well, which is when you're doing this structured rollout, if you publish the first few chapters, but you haven't finished the final chapters, and what you've published ends with the words, in the next chapter, we'll see how to handle right to left text. That's reassuring for the reader, whereas if it just stops, they may think, oh, they're not going to talk about the thing that I wanted to know. So you give them a little hope. This might actually be the only one that's genuinely controversial. I went to the Docs mini-conf for several of the talks, and I know this is a big issue that a lot of people are interested in. This is also the last of these controversial advice slides, so if you want to photograph it and start an argument on social media later, you need to do that now. Style checking, when I say do this in the editor, not in the test suite or the build chain, I'm talking about like checking for passive voice and weasel words and things like that. The reason I think you need to do this in the editor is that I think the tooling still just isn't that great. This is natural language processing stuff, which just sort of only advances with Moore's law. And once a file's in version control, it's a lot more fragile and harder to do that on. So if you're going to do this style checking, grammar checking stuff, my advice is do it in Emacs, not in Travis. Although that does lead into the next section, which is that I know even if you don't regard continuous integration as a necessity for writing documentation when you're working with an existing project that's probably already in use. So when you want to stage a large documentation project and have it work with the existing large code project, some things you need to focus on would include doing a full read-through of everything that's been published. And the thing that you can get from doing that, and not really any other way, is looking for voice consistency, which is something you can only check across the whole document. This would be things like whether or not you're always addressing the reader as first person or second person. We do this, or you do this. If you just look at one chapter or one page in isolation, you won't catch necessarily that you've changed. Other high-level things like that, whenever you introduce any example, do you have a paragraph that explains why it's relevant, or do you sort of only do that sort of expectation setting at each chapter? It's really hard for linters to ever catch that sort of thing, so this is something you need a full read-through to look for. Individual patches, you don't necessarily need to do this. It certainly doesn't hurt, but definitely with big releases, make sure that gets done. Another item for documentation review is it's vital to include outside reviewers and non-native language readers. Ideally, people outside the project. That may not be plausible for everyone, but certainly people who are users and not just developers is helpful. One of the most helpful reviewers when I was working on the HarfBuzz project he was a contributor, but he was also sort of the internationalization person for LibreOffice, which is a consumer of HarfBuzz. And there's a lot of things where the maintainer can tell you what a function is supposed to do, but you really need someone who's used it in the wild with GTK or something else to say when this is necessary and whether or not this is a corner case or something that everyone's going to need to do. So his help from that, bringing that LibreOffice perspective, was invaluable in establishing what did and did not need further discussion. And another thing maybe to note here is that, for better or worse, a lot of people think of documentation as a difficult task that's not for them, but they will be comfortable giving feedback. So the more of those people you can draw in the review stage, the more input they'll have, and the stronger your eventual documentation will be. When it comes to where you store your documentation, the big hurdle is that you often don't get to choose as the docs writer, and that can interfere with my idealistic advice about staging rollouts. So how things build, whether it has to live in a pull request until it's 100% done, that can be an awkward fit. HarfBuzz has this issue. There are different doc generators for different types of content. The inline code is GTK doc because HarfBuzz comes from the GNOME project. The user manual is something else entirely. And I would like to think there's a solution to that. So if you have advice on how to overcome these issues, by all means, let me know. When it comes to testing, I have strong opinions here. You can overreach and try and automate too many things just because it's possible to do so much today. Definitely test that the docs build. I would say definitely use spell checking if you can. Make sure your images exist and that sort of thing. I would include some quasi-grammar, quasi-spell-checking terminology things here as well. And the use case I'm thinking of from HarfBuzz is that there's some semi-controversial terms in the Unicode and OpenType specs because they're added by like national governments, which might only care about the majority language, and so we really had to like thread the needle on exactly how we phrased some things. And that again it's helpful to check for real specific matches and make sure you're saying things in the polite way to, you know, it's not just about ensuring that they're spelled correctly. On the other hand, I'm really just not impressed with grammar and style checking, at least what's available today. My personal feeling is I know there are people who like these a lot, the linters that check for passive voice and so on. I feel like you spend a lot of time configuring those and you really only get a handful of checks out of them. On the other hand, this may be very useful for you if you're not a native speaker of the language that you're writing in. But even then, I think it's probably better for each doc writer to create the system that is most useful for them on their own machine than to try and build it into what is run in continuous integration. Yeah, like I said at the very beginning, stage rollout is beneficial. You have to make different decisions about how you publish each document or each unit, and it's not easy when the project that already exists does not align with what you need to do here. The ideal case is you publish a unit whenever you're finished with it. The one thing that is probably more important to look out for is that reference material does not get published in an internally inconsistent state, where there's something that's mentioned in subsection N but is said that it's deprecated in subsection M. I think it's okay for a user manual to have holes in it. Like I said earlier, you can sort of communicate by how you start and end chapters that there's more to come. But think about a user trying to diagnose a problem with reference material. What you don't want is for most of the docs to talk about the 73 release and some of them to talk about 74. So either deploy updates to reference material when you make a release or just version everything. On the other hand, it's far more acceptable to update even small changes in a tutorial or user manual without necessarily, possibly even on every commit. I think that works pretty well, assuming that you do the review. And as you might have guessed, it's worth adding that the nuances of CI and continuous deployment are things where I have the least firsthand experience. So we're nearing the end here, and if you have good ideas to share about that, that's definitely something I'd be interested in you asking about or commenting on when we pass the mic around. Ultimately, there's no substitute for doing all the planning work up front. That's because the structure is important, but also because having the plan and having it written down transforms the large documentation project into definable goals and steps. And that's how you solve a big problem. I would like that to be good news for everyone. Maybe to put it in a different way, maybe you feel like you can't write documentation, but planning documentation is definitely something you can do. And even if that's all that you accomplish, if your project today has no documentation, I hope you'll at least plan out what it should be, because that will put you on the right track and will make it much easier to take that next step when the time comes or when the right people come along. That's all for right now. If you have complaints, here are the myriad of ways you can send them to me. Depending on how much you hate freedom, you may want to avoid some of those. But we've got a few minutes left. If you've got questions or comments, raise your hand, and here's a mic.
Big round of applause for Nathan. We have 10 minutes for questions, so just raise your hand and I'll come to you. Thanks.
So in a lot of open source projects, especially smaller ones, you've got reasonably good documentation that's 10 years out of date.
Yeah.
So how do you treat that in the plan? How do you treat the existing text in the planning phase? Do you ignore it? Do you edit it? Or do you just refer to it?
Yeah, that was actually the case with HarfBuzz when I started that project. There had been, I guess I mentioned that there had been some prior attempts at writing documentation, and they were still there. And essentially, what I did was pretend they're not there, go through all these planning phases as if there was nothing there, and then once I had that, the units and the table of contents broken down, I saw what material was already there that could be adapted, and just sort of merged in what was feasible. But I don't think that there's a way to get around that problem without planning what you want the docs to look like when you're done. So I think the planning part, I feel like, does not change just because there's old material there. Yeah.
Anyone else? Here we go.
Thanks. I noticed on your slide about automated checking, you said not to check links, which seems strange because to me they're the easiest things to check.
That's true. Yeah, I did skip over that. I mean, I could back over and see if you want. Where was it? Well, yeah. In my experience, there's just a lot of false negatives in link checking. This may vary considerably depending on what sort of project you have. In the HarfBuzz case, a lot of the material about how all those shaping and positioning things work in other scripts was originally published by Microsoft in sort of not quite a specification. And several times those URLs would just change, and sometimes they would disappear and then come back. And sometimes it seemed like they were there, but they just wouldn't be reachable because the weather in Seattle was bad that day. But we needed to keep dealing with disappearing links that were actually there. And yeah, it confuses the issue so much. I would rather leave that to human beings than have to also just go through all of these false positives. But again, I mean, it probably does depend not just on what types of links you're dealing with there, but how many there are. Well, I should also say, yeah, that's external links. Check your internal links. That's a different animal. Yeah.
So a quick follow-up comment. If you don't do it automatically, unfortunately, it may not get done at all. So doing some things badly automatically may be better than the non-existent manual options.
Yeah, I'm glossing over the notion that you do this every time there's a commit. You can do it automatically on a less frequent basis and reap a lot of benefits. But if it's something that gets run multiple times a day and gives you a lot of false positives, then it becomes an annoyance, I think. So it's a balancing act, I guess.
Would you recommend different styles for different types of users? So for example, if content editors do require a bit of more, explorative type of help, whereas for developers, for future developers, you need to pass very low-level technical information, would you recommend using different type of documentation for different type of users?
Yeah, it needs to suit the background and the needs of the reader. Unfortunately, that's not just a cut and paste sort of thing. You really have to understand who your readers and users are to know what they want and what they expect. But I think you can capture some of that by one of those early planning phases where I recommended that you go back through mailing lists and issues and things. You'll get a feel for what level most people are asking questions at, and that should help you narrow in on the right tone to use with people, I think. But yeah, you definitely need to It's also the sort of thing that feedback from actual users will tell you if you're wrong about. So getting their review is essential there.
And to follow up, what's your advice on putting the documentation into a single document versus multi-document?
Well, my position is that documents that have different functions need to be separate from each other. So reference documentation and tutorials need to be written and built separately because they have different, you update them in different ways and you roll them out differently, and the readers are probably very different. So I think keeping them separate at that level makes the rest of the jobs easier to get done.
What about chapter-wise? If you, for example, have smaller chapters to go through as a files rather than the chapters, otherwise the document would become too long from that sort of perspective.
I'm not sure I know what you mean exactly by becoming too long.
So what we found on the recent projects, we actually start putting more. So we used to have a lot of MD files. So for example, for the developer documentation, lots of MD files. And lately we actually start packing them back together into single file because we found it's actually easier. But before, our style of documentation was more explorative, so more explanation even for developers, which we found there was a lot of information that weren't needed. So eventually we came that more concise, smaller document. So
what were the empty files exactly? What was
not empty, just like a smaller files. Yeah. So let's say put single chapter per file when you convert it into MD form.
My only experience in sort of wrangling that question was I would end up dividing things just sort of not at the top level, but like the secondary level. So trying to get sub-chapters in separate files seemed like it was too cluttered to me. And so the HarfBuzz docs I mentioned, 2 top-level sections, not counting the generic where do you find the code material. So the shaping chapter, the command line tools, section and section, maybe 1 chapter. I mean, 1 file per chapter at that level, but below then it just seemed like it was becoming harder to remember which subsection was in which file. So diminishing returns by dividing things further. But probably that's as much of a personal issue as anything that you can generalize on. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? Last chance? All right. Thank you very much.
Cool.